Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. Today we have an interview with Francisco Blanco, the founder and principal of Conducta, a company helping life science firms navigate complex changes. Francisco has extensive experience in the industry, including roles at Thermo Fisher and IQVIA, and he's here today to share insights on the customer journey for biotechs and for their CDMO partners, and the crucial human element of change management. Welcome, Francisco.
Hello, Luke.
Well, thank you for joining us today. To kick off with, could you share a bit about your journey within the life sciences industry, please, and what led you to forming your own consultancy?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm a scientist by degree. I'm a chemist. I didn't fancy too much life in the lab. So fairly quickly, I decided to move out of the lab, out of the bench. And my first role back in the days was with a Thermo Fisher Quintiles joint venture called Senduit, that is now part of IQVIA.
Mm-hmm.
So I've started as a project manager in the IRT world. So essentially digitizing supply chains, clinical supply chains, and working with big pharma, but also small biotechs. After a few years, I could lead that team, that project management team. Then the company, Thermo Fisher, decided to, push that company to IQVIA, so move out of the joint venture. And I have, decided for myself to stay with Thermo Fisher.
Mm-hmm.
So I've worked, in supply chain. I've led client services teams at Thermo Fisher within the CMO division. I've been in strategic sales, strategic business development, and the last job that I had was leading a small business unit out of Europe, again, for the CMO division. 2017, I've decided to move on after almost 15 years working for Thermo. And so I started my own consultancy.
What led to that? Going from established companies, big, albeit, being in a small division of a company like Thermo Fisher, to saying now's the time to go it alone and do my own thing?
It wasn't a master plan. I just felt like, after 15 years, I've seen a lot of, how big pharma works and small biotechs. And I was looking for a new challenge, and I didn't know what that new challenge should be. Initially. So we had, more on a personal note, we had our second newborn. And first of all, I've decided to take a sabbatical and just spend more time with family, So, and after this 6 months, I started thinking about, okay, what comes next? Wasn't too keen on joining, big pharma or another big organization, because I had seen that, been there, seen it 15 years. And so what I've done then, back in 2017 is I've just started reaching out to my contacts, with my network. Those were my former clients. And it happened that the timing was right for two reasons. Some of my previous contacts had been moving out of big pharma into small biotechs. And these biotechs, small companies, were heavily investing into cell and gene therapies. So, for me, it was like a deja vu, because I have been involved with Novartis Kymriah in their clinical trials. Some I know that Life Technologies had been supplying, which was part of Thermo. Have been supplying magnetic dynabeads for the Kymriah clinical trials as part of their manufacturing process. I had been involved remotely, but then 2017, when I heard that cell and gene therapy was booming, I was just really interested. And frankly, I was interested in working again with my old contacts, and those were now leading manufacturing, leading supply chains, being CEOs of these small biotechs. So that's what led me into consulting, initially just for cell and gene therapy.
What kind of services, what was the value add that you'd bring to those biotech companies?
You have to imagine that these companies back in the days were just spinning out of university. So they had an idea. These were small teams, 10, 15, 20 FTs. Then they had a few, one, two, three executives from big pharma, but they had to set up everything from scratch. Thinking of cell and gene, which is personalized medicine. We're not talking any longer about make the stock. So you have to set up the entire supply chain from scratch. There were not many playbooks back in the day. Novartis had been there. They have been experimenting with the supply chain, the systems, but these biotechs were just new to the field. They had a good asset, they had great scientists, but they needed people that understood the supply chain, that understood systems, processes, and then how to deal with partners. Because they couldn't manufacture everything in-house, so they had to go out and work with CDMOs. And so, along with that, the supply chain in terms of, procurement and manufacturing and the logistics, and then the interfaces with either the hospitals, the communication flows, but also with CDMOs, how to set them up, what kind of CDMOs to work with.
It's very complex, isn't it? Within cell and gene, we're totally different small molecule or even large molecule biologics.
It was pure luck that I was there in that moment and that I could satisfy all those needs. Because that had been my career at Thermo, and working with so many different companies. I had seen the supply chain. I had worked with big, small companies. I knew small, large molecules and cell and gene. And I had a background in client services, which helped build those biotechs in setting up communication flows with the hospitals.
And what were some of those? What were some of the main challenges which you sort of saw again and again as people were trying to go from academia, from the lab, and starting to operationalize a supply chain? There must have been certain roadblocks which you encountered again and again.
I mean, there were certainly many, Luke. I think that, it's the same when you're starting a company as a entrepreneur. You just have to be very hands-on. So that's number one. Number two is when there's no playbook, in this field particularly, it's not like you could take the playbook from, small molecules, supply chain, or large molecules, maybe to some extent, but you were pretty much starting from scratch. So working your way through and maybe sometimes not knowing, which way to go, but, one of the, at least for me, elements that have helped me a lot is talking to the hospitals, and asking them, okay, what is the best way for you? If you were to tell the biotech, just make my life easier, so how should we set up that process? What should be our communication lines? Because these hospitals have other stuff to do other than dealing with, SOPs and systems of different, biotechs.
What does make it easier for the hospitals? If you were sort of talking about your playbook around then, what's the playbook for really interfacing well with hospitals?
Maybe more than a playbook is the mindset, Luke, of how should biotechs serve hospitals? Essentially our clients within, the setup of a clinical study. So this client experience or, customer experience, the approach, the mindset, being proactive, that certainly helps, not putting too much burden on the hospitals, again, documentation, checklists, forms, templates, systems, ask them, what makes sense for them, so that, they can be as efficient as they can because their job is to treat patients, is not to deal with the bureaucracy of pharma or biotech. So understanding that, I think it's key. And what has helped me is, having already that client services mindset.
Very interesting. You've worked with both large pharmaceutical companies as well as small biotech firms. What would you say some of the differences are in their approaches to customer service and relationship management?
It's very different,
Mm,
as people in this field know. Working with a big pharma company, I mean, big pharma companies are typically transactional in their approach. They have, large teams of, you have procurement, you have different technical users, you have quality
mhm,
involved, you might have IT involved. So they have large teams. And so based on the maturity of their business with large and small molecules, they know how they want to work with suppliers, right? So the relationship is typically very systems and process
mhm.
driven, um, which requires a specific skill set at the CDMO, not just in terms of capacity, capabilities, systems, but more the people.
It's having the right people in that virtual factory who can interface. Yeah.
Exactly. If you're looking at the biotechs, they're much more, they require a consultative approach, obviously, because they're still, you know, looking for ways how to set up their clinical
Mm,
trial or go to market. So here, they would expect a bit more guidance from CDMOs. The relationship is often more personal. There's many touch points, and you get the feeling that you're in it together,
mhm,
right? And so, looking at these two different business models or service models for service suppliers, you ought to think, what are the people that you match to either working with a big pharma or with a
mhm,
biotech? Because in the end, I mean, let's take one step back. There's four key reasons why in a B2B environment, um, you buy services. And this is number one, to increase your revenue. Number two, increase your profit. Number three, to de-risk, so lower your
mhm,
risks. Number four, to increase your speed, right? So the CDMOs and service providers in general, they can be enablers in, increasing the profits and the revenues of biotech's pharma. But they can be drivers in, you know, de-risking the supply chain and increasing the
mm,
speed. And what does that mean? In terms of decreasing the risk, that means that you need to have a certain capacity in place and certain capabilities in place, which at some point, most service providers will have. Um, if you're looking at the speed, how to increase the speed, it's mainly two elements. Either you have the right systems in place, which nowadays most companies use very similar
mhm.
systems, IT tools, without mentioning any of the big brands.
Are you referring to ERP systems, QMS systems?
Correct. So you're not going to differentiate yourself as a CDMO by the systems
Mm,
anymore. But the last element in increasing speed is people, the staff that you have, right? And I think that's truly a differentiator in a relationship. And so when you're thinking about your service model in working with either pharma or biotech, back to your
mhm,
question, ought to think about people. So what kind of skill sets do you need, in your, project management or SMEs when you're working with a big company as opposed to a
mm,
biotech?
mm,
So on one side, you need someone that is very consultative, that has been in the industry long enough and can guide the client. In the other case, pharma, they will have their forms, they have their staff, they have their templates, they're predictive. They will tell you what to do and when to do it. So maybe you don't want to have your, you know, PM that has been in the industry for 25 years and loves to deal with clients and loves to apply his soft skills. You know
mhm,
what I mean?
mhm.
So I think this is something for companies to think through when they're, putting or assigning PMs to these
Hmm.
relationships.
Is that what you think is happening now? I mean, do you feel as though CDMOs are able to flex between a big pharma client and a biotech and give them the type of service they need or not?
So having worked the last 7, 8 years with biotechs, I've seen the other side of the fence.
Hmm.
So, I've been working with both pharma and biotechs on supply chain strategies involving procurement, outsourcing. And so going through the process of setting up RFIs, RFPs, RFQs, and interviewing some of the suppliers, um, I do feel like the human component of these relationships has been
Hmm.
lost. Um, and if you look at where do you want to position yourself as a company on the product service spectrum? So do you think that you want to be more on the product side, so selling products, equipment, machinery, where you need a low touch human component, but you need strong systems, strong processes, and this is a high volume business
Hmm.
model? Or do you want to place yourself on the service side, right? Which is complexity, design, consulting, education.
Why do you feel that the human element has been lost? Do you think it's a problem that's been getting worse since COVID, say, or what's driving that?
I think the maturity in the
Hmm.
market is driving it. I mean, I see still small service providers that are fantastic in terms of their customer approach. But you see, mature service providers that are obviously thinking about their revenues and profits as
Hmm.
well, their KPIs, their quarterly numbers. And so, I mean, this is something that we would just have to acknowledge. I mean, some of these service providers are nowadays big companies as well, and they feel the same pressure that, big pharma is feeling, in terms of delivering their, vision, mission, and numbers. Um, I do see, though, smaller CDMOs um, out of in two parts, out of a strategy, but also a need. They don't have the headcount that a big CDMO has. So you have one very skilled PM, project
Hmm.
manager, that is managing big pharma and also biotechs at the same time. And typically, when you're a small CDMO, you're going to hire key people that have a lot of
Hmm.
experience before then you start hiring junior people and junior PMs. So what I'm seeing with, again, these small CDMOs is that they really have the experience, the expertise. Um, they have the staff that is needed to, um, deal with these biotechs, and guide them and show them what is the right way.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think that it's, in a nutshell, it's a natural development of the
Yep.
market, reaching a maturity peak, if you will.
What advice would you have for those service providers, for the CDMOs who want who want to expand and they want to take on more business and start to scale up, but they want to keep that human element without losing that? What advice would you have for how to expand their operations without losing what made them special in the first place?
So I think, you have to play on both sides. I mean, obviously you need strong systems and processes, but what I would, tell them is look at the customer journey. So look at how customers want to work with you. Um, and typically there's, five key buckets along the customer journey, from assessing the relationship, initiating the relationship, then planning the project, executing, delivering, and then the close out
Mhm.
of the project. So if you look at these five phases, the initial two, three, assessing, initiating, and maybe planning, that's quite projectable. It's process driven, systems driven. The last two, execution, and the closeout, that's where companies can be the stars in the end. That's where the PMs can be the heroes in terms of anticipating the needs of customers, in terms of issue resolution, helping with
Mhm.
challenges. Um, because in the end, these last two buckets will decide if this same customer will come back or not,
Mm, mm,
right? These last two buckets will decide if you're going to have a short customer lifetime value or a long one. So what I would say is look at how clients in different segments, because there's no one large pharma and there's no one
mm.
biotech. So you have to set up different segments based on the sizes, the needs, modalities, geographies, cultures, and then just go through these five buckets and see how you can serve in the best way these different client segmentations. So that would be my advice.
Looking outside of pharma and in FMCG or telecoms, certainly aviation and in industries like that, who are really good at the whole CX journey, they generally tend to measure and benchmark their customers all the way through the journey, and whether that's using NPS or surveying and other tools all the way through that. Is that something that the pharma industry could learn from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the next step, once you've mapped out the customer
Mm,
journeys, is to start setting up processes, and how you want your staff, your team to interact with clients, which can be very personal, phone calls, video conferences,
hmm
email, but also using platforms. And I think that where companies have to go is to start looking into the data they have at hands, whether it's unstructured data, emails, or structured data based on the systems they're
hmm
using, and put information, pulling that information out of the data and analyzing the data.
mm.
Um, I think that surveys are good. I think that most CDMOs are doing at least the bigger ones are doing surveys. But what they do with the surveys, that's another question, how they set up the surveys.
hmm
I've frankly done surveys in the past. I've seen surveys in the present, and I can read based on how the surveys have been written, what is the expectations.
Mm.
So I see it's going to be already a good survey with high, ratings, or if it's like an honest survey where truly the service provider wants to know how can we
Mm.
improve. Also, the timing of the survey is key. Are you sending out surveys at the end of the quarter, or are you sending surveys when you think there's something going wrong in your
Yep.
relationship, or when there's a peak? So I think I'm not a huge fan of surveys unless they're set up in a candid way to accept also feedback from clients that might
Mm,
hurt,
mm.
you know?
I wonder if you could share maybe a couple of examples that you've experienced. So, one example of what truly great customer experience that went above and beyond expectations, and also maybe some of the worst customer experiences you've seen. Be great to get a bit of color to this.
Some of the worst experiences, to use that
Mhm.
terminology, in our space, whether it's clinical or commercial, but maybe more clinical because there's more degrees of freedom. There's just much more going on at the same time. Um, Commercial, typically, it's you have the larger volumes, your systems are in place, processes, SOPs are in place. Um, so within clinical, um, it's very, fast paced. So what I see on and on again is um, slow reactions,
Mm.
from service providers. And this is not just emails, phone calls. I think that nowadays, no sponsor should be chasing a service provider for
Mhm.
information. Um, I think service providers either need to be staffed accordingly to serve a customer, a project, or they need to have the systems in place.
Mm.
Um, so that's what I'm seeing over and over again, that too many sponsors are looking for information
Yep.
and they feel alone, and there is a huge gap in a such fast-paced environment like clinical trials. You just don't have the time, and that shouldn't happen
Mm,
anymore.
mm.
Um, on a good positive note, it's quite the opposite, obviously. But I have to say that when I see, five-star client services from CDMOs, it's typically not so much because of the strength of their processes. It's more the individual.
Mm.
And you can feel that there's one person, there that has a sound background, um, that just feels what is needed, and he or she goes the extra mile. And when there's big uncertainty and people look around for someone to take the lead, and that person at the CDMO comes up with, yeah, I'll take that on. I'll do that for you. Maybe I don't know how to do it, but let me take that back. I'll circle
Mm-hmm.
back at some point. Just give me some time. I'll come back to you. That hero moment, I think it's so key because you have to put yourself in the shoes of these companies. There's many unknowns in these studies. So the clients are struggling themselves with their own challenges within their
Mm-hmm.
companies. They don't have more challenges with the CDMO or the service provider. So they're expecting someone that crosses that line and helps them
Yep.
out, not just with the challenges that you might have, in your own four walls, but also, helping them out with the unknowns. And there's many unknowns that even clients do not know yet, and they're looking for someone to tell them, look, just watch out for A, B,
Yep.
C. Just like you said, and once we get there, I can help you out, but just that you have that on your radar.
Someone that can help them to think 6, 12 months ahead, I suppose, if they're trying to get their drug through the pipeline.
Exactly, exactly. Just thinking a bit beyond what is
Mm.
expected, because there's many companies that do, deliver standards, the standard expected work, which is typical project management, SME, project plans, there's milestones. And so that's out there, but what is new?
Mm.
What's again your differentiator?
So, despite all the technological advances, it really is still down to the right people being there to pull everything together.
In our environment that is so complex and service
Mm.
driven, yes, the human component is key. Absolutely. And what kind of person you put to that
Hmm.
relationship is key. And how you train that person and coach the person and develop the person is really
Mm-mm.
imperative.
As someone who has worked so closely on cell and gene therapies across many different customers, I wonder what your feeling is right now about the cell and gene space, specifically in Europe, going into 2025. You mentioned earlier 2017, I think, was a time of huge promise and excitement for these advanced modalities. Checking the pulse of how you're finding it right now, what do you think 2025 is going to look like?
Well, look, I think that 2025 is going to be better
Mm.
than 2024. I think that the last 2 years have been really challenging for the entire industry. Um, and there's different components to that. High inflation in the US, less capital available, but also, maybe too many Me Too assets. CD19, another CD19 with maybe a slightly better safety profile. And then investors, seeing that some of the companies that are commercial with their assets are struggling to make
Mm.
their numbers, So it just seems that the business, putting yourself in the shoes of investors, these assets are just, from an investment point of view, not as attractive as maybe assumed, you know, 7, 8,
Mm-hmm.
9 years ago, right? Because there's already some assets out there. So it's, the cost of goods,
Yep.
it's still too high. Market access, it's still, the big countries, based on the prices that are expected, it's still the US and some countries in Europe, and I think that there still needs to be a lot of work done in these areas. We're just not there. Again, the inflation didn't help that, there was just less cash going into the small biotechs in the last 2 years. Um, Now this is changing. Inflation is coming down. But I have to say that, working with VCs as well, they're attracted to new
Mm.
modalities, mRNA, COVID, that's big, Um, radiopharmaceuticals are coming back after 10, 15 years again, So there's a higher competition for money for cell and gene
Mm.
therapies in the market. So I expect it's going to be better than the last 2 years, but the competition
Mm.
is tougher. Yeah. So what I would ask is what I think most cell and gene therapy companies would ask for is more cash into this modality, more money,
Sure.
particularly in Europe.
Francisco, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you and looking forward to you joining us at CDMO Live in May.
Likewise. Thanks a lot for your time, Luke.
Experience the future of contract manufacturing at CDMO Live 2025. Join us at the World Trade Centre Rotterdam on May the 7th and 8th, 2025 for an exclusive event that brings together the sharpest minds in biopharma outsourcing. For 2 days filled with market insights, best practices and partnering. Early bird tickets are now available, so head to cdmolive.com to download the agenda and to book your ticket.